The Development Action Group says the 30 billion rand Mooikloof megacity project raises red flags for the future of housing. The project has been lauded as a perfect example of public-private partnerships in infrastructure development. Here to tell us why we shouldn't be getting as excited as some South Africans have been is Aditya Kuma, who is the group's executive director. Adi, good evening and thank you so much for your time. Well, you're certainly calling for a much more sober look at this public-private partnership, which of course the president has been, raving about. His head of infrastructure has also been raving about it as something that is going to fundamentally change the lives of many working-class South Africans.
Thanks for having me on the show. Yes, it's a very, very ambitious project and very impressive project. And the questions that we're asking us are specifically about what are the trade-offs. So 30 billion rand invested in a huge development such as this means that a lot of precious resources at the moment will be invested on a vacant land that needs to be serviced. And it's a substantial cost that goes into it. Whereas the priorities for housing, unfortunately, lie in many other ways. And part of the concern that we're raising is not just about this development, but also about what happens to other aspects of housing that need to be dealt with urgently, particularly the issue of informal settlements and the thousands that are living in backyard structures that needs to be dealt with. And those do not require these kind of mega projects. The other piece that we've obviously... Yes, sure.
Of course, to draw some of your conclusions, you've looked at previous megacity projects and public-private partnerships between government and the business sector in Cape Town and in KZN. Tell us about what we know from those projects and I suppose the lessons that you're drawing from there.
So the first big lesson that we're drawing from there is that state infrastructure creates property value. And very often the kind of value that it creates is for the private developers. And this value, once it's created, essentially ends up enriching the private developers rather than aiding the people that actually need to benefit from it. So places like Tongaat and KZN, Century City in Cape Town, haven't substantially made any dent in terms of housing for the poor or even for the middle class. They have become enclaves for mostly the upper middle class and the rich. And so when public resources are invested into these megacities, you have to ensure that the returns eventually come back to the people of the country, that it does not become privatized at the end of the day. And part of the kind of appeal right now is, or the questions are really about having more details about how government intends to regulate and manage the property escalations that would come as a consequence of these investments.
Ultimately, you're also saying that these property developments can be exclusionary in nature, so that even though they are meant to service a certain part of the population that effectively has been priced out of the market, while the intent begins being good, and we see the rate at which some of these houses have been cost at 400,000 to about 700,000. You say ultimately, due to this infrastructure development, that ultimately leads to prices being much higher than what they were intended to.
Absolutely. And the big point is that as these projects get built, the prices become higher and eventually the people will on-sell to other people. Now, under FLIS, which is the model that the president has announced that all these 50,000 units will be, there used to be previously a restriction of 8 years before you could on-sell any of the units. But that restriction over the last 2-3 years has been removed. So what this means, particularly in the context of COVID, is that people who might have precarious income might be able to get a mortgage now and get the subsidy and purchase one of these properties. In the next 3 to 4 years, might not have the same employment status and might have a change in their income status, and as a consequence have to on-sell. And as they on-sell, depending on how the property market is doing, these units could subsequently keep becoming more and more unaffordable till actually it doesn't become a project necessarily for the poor.
Of course, Adi, it's one thing to look at an idea that already exists and say, actually, this is a bad idea. But what are the solutions? What are the alternatives that government can be exploring?
So I guess there are two kind of options that we're putting on the table. So first is that if this development is to go forward, there must be a strong mix of different types of units. We know from experience, not just in South Africa, but in many other countries, that public rental stock and social housing is an essential component of making sure that housing stock remains affordable for a long time. And I think that's a very essential component, particularly in the context of COVID, to protect our citizens, that the market forces do not render them homeless at the end of the day. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that this must be coupled with multiple investments in basic services for informal settlements, housing plans for informal settlements, whether it's informal settlement upgrading, or even other models that need to be developed. I think there's a number of discussions taking place at the National Department about exploring various different models of housing which might not necessarily be in the housing code at the moment, but need to be considered perhaps in the future as instruments to deal with the housing backlog that we have in the country.
You know, when we look at this mega city, it brings us to part of the district development model of the state, right? Where in many ways they're trying to create these economic hubs where activity can take place and people don't ever really need to leave because they don't have access to opportunity. That project by government has been a long time in the making. Why is it that we have seen other attempts to build these centers of economic activity, such as a little Johannesburg in the Waterberg region of Limpopo, where the Medupi power station is? That was also one of the plans, but it hasn't quite materialized. Why do you think that is?
I mean, the simple answer is location. The economic centers are determined not just by where you're developing the property. The economic centers are developed by where the amenities and where the engine of the government works at the moment. So the moment big developments like this come up, the questions that we have to ask is, how close, how much proximity there is in terms of economic centers, and is there public transport available, readily available, affordable public transport available for people to get from where they live to where they work. The other flip side of this, of course, is, how do you spurn the economy in the current conditions? And really, it's about supporting the local construction sector that needs to come up and develop such developments at the end of the day.
One of the issues that we've seen raised around this particular deal has been the choice of contractor and who exactly is going to benefit from it. And you raised the issue of small to medium enterprises in the construction sector, which are particularly struggling and quite frankly barely survive when they're not being subcontracted by some of these big entities.
That's a very good point, because that's exactly what is happening in the construction sector at the moment. Large construction companies get contracts and very often use the small to medium-sized companies to be labor brokers, essentially. And because government stipulates on most of its tenders, often up to 30% for local companies to be used, it becomes a subcontracting deal between the large contractor and the small companies. However, in many of these contracts, there isn't sufficient resources to put into training and mentoring some of these contractors to become viable companies. So we've seen over the last kind of 5 years, many of the construction companies that are at CIDB grading 1 or 2 have remained there static at all, because all they've been doing is subcontracting for large construction companies with no resources for them to become better graded so that they can take on more public contracts and government work.
Of course, part of the appeal for a project like this is that it's simply the scale of it, right? The rate of employment of jobs that it's set to create. It's a big project. Have these projects always been reached to full scale? Do we have a history of completing such projects to full scale?
Well, many different mega projects have been promised in the countries and often create thousands of jobs. Joe Slovo in Cape Town has been one of them. There's a number of catalytic projects that have been put on the table as well by the National Department of Human Settlements that are in process. Very often these projects underestimate the amount of social facilitation and contestation for housing on the ground. And very often these developments do not reach its intended scale. So, you'll say we're going to develop 20,000 housing opportunities, but you end up doing maybe like 2,000 to 5,000 housing opportunities, and then you have to close up the project because you can't move further. So I think it isn't a strength in the country at the moment, the capability of being able to run these mega projects to fruition. And while it seems very tempting at the moment to think of the 41,000 jobs created, the number of housing units, we have to carefully examine to make sure that this doesn't become one of those projects that stops at 5,000 units, and then you wonder why so much of budget and so much of public investment was made into it.
So effectively, if I'm also hearing you correctly, Adi, you are suggesting that this 1 billion rand, which government has said is going to be the total amount of money that it puts into this project in terms of this infrastructure development of roads, of bulk infrastructure, are you saying that that price tag is likely to come up to much more than that?
I mean, it's very likely to come up more than that. I mean, these kind of vacant parcels of land, to service them, to do the technical studies, feasibility analysis, the engineering, all of these things is a very expensive exercise. And you have to have the confidence that at the end of the day, not only will it have the return of investment, as the President has said, and those numbers generally sound about right, but it's also about the social justice component of what this housing development is going to do. Is it actually going to be affordable for the people that this is targeting at the moment?
That was Adi Kumar, the Executive Director of the Development Action Group. Thanks for your time on News at Prime.